what has changed in Paris, France, over the last year? Joining us now via Skype to talk about this is our friend, Dr. Daniel Pipes of the Middle East Forum. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Pipes.
Thank you, Ezra.
I have a question for you. A year ago, when Charlie Hebdo was attacked, more than 1 million Frenchmen marched through the city. It was quite a stirring moment. But in November, not 1 year later, when 10 times as many people were murdered across Paris at various sites, so 130 murdered, 368 injured, and the response seemed tepid. It was 10 times the carnage. But there was no million-person march. There was no 20, 30 world leaders jetting to France to show solidarity. I went to Paris, and people knew something was not right, but they couldn't articulate it. It seemed like they had gotten used to a certain level of casualties. What do you think has happened in Paris over the last year?
Well, I certainly agree with you that you can't bring together 1 million people and all those leaders every time there's one of these atrocities. They happen too often. I'd also note that the atrocity a year ago, the attack, the assault a year ago, was partly against celebrities. The editors, the cartoonists, the writers of Charlie Hebdo were well-known figures, and I think that had a lot to do with it. Whenever you have someone who's well-known be assassinated, it has a much bigger impact than if they're not known. For example, in the Netherlands, Theo van Gogh was murdered in November 2004, and it had a huge impact on the country, and it was just one person. So I would attribute some to repetition and some to the fact that the Charlie Hebdo staff were celebrities.
I have a theory that terrorism is it scares people to a certain degree. That's the word terrorism. And Islamophobia, I mean, it's used as an insult, but if you look at it, I suppose it can mean fear of Islam. I mean, I am afraid of a terrorist bomb or a terrorist attack somewhat, but I think in the West there's a larger fear. I call it Islamophobia phobia. That is, being afraid of being called anti-Muslim.
Yes.
And I look at, for example, the New Year's attacks in Cologne, Germany, where up to 1,000 Muslim migrants swarmed German women and girls and groped them and assaulted them and even allegedly raped one of them. And I mean, that's terrifying, but I think the police and the mayor and the justice minister were actually more scared of calling it Islamic crime, just like the police in Rotherham, UK were more scared. Are we actually more scared of fighting against terrorism than we are of terrorism itself?
I think there's a deep reluctance to point the finger to Islam in any fashion, in part because there's a sense of guilt, and in part because there's a worry about the implications of this. Once you start looking at Muslims as opposed to non-Muslims, then that has all sorts of implications for the social order. To put it in brief, you'll have to have security like the Israeli airport or on the Israeli buses and restaurants. It leads to all sorts of difficult repercussions once you allow that there's a certain group of people, that there's a certain ideology in common. And so there's a great reluctance to do so.
Now, I read an interesting comment by you on your website that you don't use the word terrorism as much as some conservatives do. Not for the reasons that like the CBC or the BBC refuse to say terrorism. They don't say it because they think it's too judgmental and they don't want to take sides versus the terrorists versus stuff. You have a theory that there are better, more accurate, and more powerful words to use than terrorism, the war against terrorism. Tell me your theory.
Well, in part it is that the word terrorism is never, nobody agreed, no two people agree on what it means. And so you have these endless sterile debates about whether something is terrorism or not. You'll have one police department say that this certain event was terroristic and the next one say it wasn't. You'll have the Iranian, the Saudi, and other malign governments using this word, the Syrian government, using this word to justify their attacks on civilians. It goes on and on and on. So it's a useless word in itself. Plus, even if you do agree with it, so what? What does it mean? What I'm really interested in, I think you're really interested in, is the motives for it. Not the technical nature of it, but what are the motives? Is this some family member who's upset? Is it a bunch of criminals who are fighting each other? Is it two lovers, two rival lovers for a woman's hand? Is it just a crazy person? Or is it something that is ideological, has to do with who controls the country, who controls the world? That's what interests me. Is it jihad or is it not jihad, in short?
I think that's a great point, and it's something that our mutual friend Tarek Fata says. He really zeroes down. He says, are you for the jihad? Are you for violence to promote Islam or not? And that's really terrorism, it's almost like saying, it's almost like a conservative objection to gun control. Well, a gun is a tool that can be used for good or for ill or by this person or that person. It's not the gun that interests conservatives or people care about national security, it's people who use that tool. So terrorism, I suppose, means crimes to a certain kind of crime. But if you say radical Islam or the jihad, you're getting right through to it. And that's I think, so in that way I would agree that saying jihad or armed jihad or violent jihad is more useful than the phrase terrorism. Is that sort of where you're coming from?
Yeah, I've just stopped using the word terrorism in the last several months, and I find I don't miss it. Counterterrorism, I'm afraid, I still have to use, but terrorism itself, I don't use. Now, there are legal implications. If a crime is considered a terrorist crime, has all sorts of implications, certainly in the United States, in terms of insurance, in terms of what kind of jail sentence, where the jail is, and all these other things. And I respect that, but at the same time, I think it is not a useful term. And instead of arguing over what is and is not terrorism, topic which takes up an awful lot of time, we should instead focus on, is this political, religious in nature? Is there a goal here about affecting the nature of the power structure, or is this just somebody doing violence for criminal or other reasons?
Yeah. Before we go, I want to come back to something I mentioned earlier, and that is what happened on New Year's Eve in Cologne and other German cities. It seems self-evident to me that when you bring in 1 million migrants, of whom, depending on what source you look at, up to 75, 80% are young Muslim men. So these are single, military-age men. To use a phrase, they're horny. They come from a culture that has not yet discovered chivalry or feminism or even treating women equally. So you bring in hundreds of thousands of young men, maybe who are not only not used to dealing with women, but maybe not even used to dealing with alcohol. You pour them into city streets in Stuttgart, Hamburg, Cologne. They see pretty Western-dressed women. It's a recipe for sexual violence, especially if you have that added layer of, well, she's just an infidel girl. She's a kafir to begin with. Can you tell me what lessons emerge from what happened in Germany? I mean, it's incredible to me that Angela Merkel is doubling down and insisting that the refugees will continue to come by the million. What's going on there, and will anything stop it?
To me, the most remarkable thing about the Cologne incident is that there appear to have been something like 1,000 young men. Now, I initially thought there were 20 or 30. Okay, you're some rowdy group, but 1,000? That changes it entirely. So this is not your run-of-the-mill assault. This is something that must have been organized. This is something where there must have been communications. And surely someone could come forward and reveal. So it would be very, very interesting to find out how 1,000 men of Middle Eastern background found themselves in some fashion organized in front of the Cologne railroad station. As for Angela Merkel, what we're seeing is that the establishment, the politicians, the press, the police, the professors, the prosecutors, I like all the P's, are generally, even when they're conservative, like Merkel is, reluctant to acknowledge that there is an Islamic element, that there is a problem here. And when a problem does arise, as you noted, they double down. They just insist that you're not seeing what you see. And in Germany, at this point, in the last few days, there has been a severe restriction on the freedom of speech. In German, if you're going to be posting on Facebook or Twitter in German, you'll be cut off if you have things to say about these problems in Germany. You can do it in English, but you can't do it in German.
Isn't
freedom
that
of
amazing?
speech.
I didn't know that. I want to, you mentioned that this must have been organized, and I know the Justice Minister of Germany called it organized crime, and I scoffed. I thought, well, what, the mafia? There's a new way to make money here. They've got the gambling, they've got the illegal drugs. They're going to make money through sexual assaults. But I take your point that to organize 1,000 men, but let me push back on you on that one. If you bring in 1.1 million Muslims, which I understand is the number that Germany did last year, and if, let's say, 700,000 of them are young men. Okay, so in a city like Cologne, which I think is the 4th largest city in Germany, let's say you've got 100,000, or let's just say 50,000 young men, unemployed or unemployable, milling around, and it's New Year's Eve, and it's the Central Plaza, and it's excitement, and there's fireworks, and it's, I mean, I don't think it's hard to imagine that in a city like Cologne, if you have 50 or 100,000 young Muslim men, that 1,000 are going to show up in the Grand Central Plaza on New Year's Eve. I mean, it would be like their Times Square. I don't think it takes someone organizing a bunch of young Muslim men if you've just poured in, 750,000 of them in the last year.
Grant you the demographics that you just gave, but I think having the audacity to go out and grope and rape the women there en masse requires some kind of organization. Somebody's saying, let's do this. We can get away with it. This is a good idea.
I think it's the mob mentality. Like I'm reminded.
I mean, we're speculating, but it just doesn't seem.
In Canada, we had Stanley Cup riots in Vancouver some years back, where there were so many people downtown. There was booze involved. There was a moment, and that mob mentality takes over. People say, oh, everyone else is doing it. I'm anonymous. It's dark. They don't know me anyhow. Everyone around me is doing it. I'll pile on. Anyhow, you and I are both speculating. It'll be interesting to see. You're right. If there was some form of communication, we might get light of it. But I think that what the most interesting thing I've learned from you today is that in Germany, any discussion of this has been clamped down on by Facebook, which is exactly what Mark Zuckerberg promised just before the New Year's. He said that any intolerance towards Islam will be shut down on Facebook.
At the behest of the German authorities.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? At the behest of the German authorities. That is even more interesting. Well, listen, Dr. Pipes, we've taken up so much of your time. It's great to talk with you as always, even though the news is almost always bad. Thank you for joining us today with your expertise.